Hey neighbor, welcome back to Beyond ARTV. My name is John, and it's time for another tier list ranking, one that I've been meaning to do for quite some time. Perhaps you've seen my 2000s bands power ranking? Well, today we're doing 2010s bands that defined the decade or else were maybe really important to the genre that they were in. And if you're wondering, where did I get these bands from? I pulled them from my own head and also from my community at a recent live stream. I took suggestions, and I really wanted it to focus on bands that were super well known, important. It's a power ranking, something that maybe helped define a genre, even if it was a bit more niche. You're gonna see bands that were more mainstream and stuff that blew up in the indie sphere, and I'm gonna be giving my own thoughts on these groups, along with a ranking that factors that in, alongside their importance to their genre. I'll try and make this as quick and painless as possible and get to the point because we've got more than 40 bands to rank, starting with everyone's favorite banjo boys, Mumford & Sons. They've been embroiled in some controversy as of late, including the exit of a member, but during the 2010s, 2009, into the next decade, they were really peaking in terms of their commercial reach. This band were everything and everywhere to some people, until they slowly started fizzling out to become a little bit more niche. They're always going to have a very strong following, but I really don't know how much they brought to the table outside of a renaissance of a certain type of genre. I'm gonna put them in the C tier. Let's change directions entirely and go to BEARTOOTH, a hard-throttling band that started off as a solo project of Caleb Shomo. Their first album, Disgusting, is just incredible. It's so raw and aggressive, and the albums that followed, I personally didn't enjoy as much, but I do think that they brought a lot to this kind of post-hardcore, hardcore punk sound, and they reignited a flame that I wasn't seeing a ton of representation for, so I'm gonna put B for BEARTOOTH. How is it that a band that only put out one album during the 2010s is a part of this list at all? Well, that album, Some Nights, was, I guess, just that influential. We're talking about fun, and you know what? I'm so tempted to just throw them down in the F tier for saying, hey, where is the next album? Are you guys ever gonna get back together? It's now been 10 years. And I realized that their first album, Aim and Ignite, was, 2008, 2009? But 2012 Some Nights completely changed the game in so many different ways. They were an important trio, like it or not, like them or not. They definitely had influences from everything from Queen to a bit more of an electronic and auto-tune sound. I'm gonna have to put them in the B tier because I think that album is awesome. It definitely left a huge footprint in the sand of time. All the other kids with the pumped up kicks were quite jealous of Foster the People. They were originally a trio and they broke out with Torches in 2011. That album had some huge singles, including Pumped Up Kicks, Houdini, Hell in a Beat. There was just a nice touch of indie pop that really left a dazzling spark in the scene. I think that their next album, Supermodel, is underrated to a pretty heavy degree, as is Sacred Hearts Club. They had a successful decade as a band. Unfortunately, I cannot in good conscience say the same thing about our next band, Sleeping with Sirens, fronted by Kellen Quinn. He has a very distinct voice, let's put it that way, that can be off-putting to a lot of people. They were definitely important to the quote-unquote scene, but at the same time, they navigated away from that and they started becoming more of a pop band that would often try to revisit their rock roots. They had some solid hits during that time, but realistically, I gotta put them down in the D. I mean, we remember Gossip, right? Feeling like a brand new person that will never make the same mistake again because we've got Kevin Parker, TAME IMPALA up next. An obvious S tier placement for me. I don't know how you guys feel, but TAME IMPALA, just Kevin Parker in general, was so important to the sound of the 2010s. This kind of psychedelic revival that didn't just rely on trying to be nostalgic. It also had a lot of forward-thinking, perfectionist type ideas. That's who Kevin Parker is, both in the studio and live, and the albums released during that decade were just game-changing. But if I close my eyes, I can almost imagine a world where this next band doesn't even really leave much behind at all, at least not a lot to be desired. We're talking about the Dan Smith-fronted Bastille. This is a band that definitely relied pretty heavily on the indie pop revival, kicking off with the grocery store anthem Pompeii in 2013. I thought their subsequent efforts like Wild World were just not up to par. They felt really dull in many ways, and I really do have to compare this band to a machete that's swinging, but it hasn't been sharpened in about 50 years, so it's like a butter knife going to a stone. I'm gonna go ahead and throw Bastille down in the D tier. I know what you're thinking. Bring Me the Horizon, a 2010s band? John, didn't you just scold us for saying, oh, where is this band? This is not a 2010s band. This is a rare exception because I think Bring Me the Horizon definitely have two distinct eras, and the second one was definitely catapulted into the limelight starting with There Is a Hell, and that was 2010. Sempiternal was the re-envisioning of this band. Jordan Fish got on board, and it kicked off a new era that included albums like That's the Spirit, and yes, Amo as well, and while there's definitely been some mixed reception in there, I think Bring Me are an incredibly important band. I'm putting them A tier. Black and White vibes for days. The Neighborhood are up next. This is another kind of indie pop, indie rock band that took a lot of interesting turns during the decade. They broke out with their debut album, I Love You, which I initially found myself liking quite a bit, but the more you come back to them, I think the more you see through their disguise, and that being the thinly veiled songwriting that doesn't necessarily have a ton of flavor to it. I just don't think this band stacks up to a lot of the ones we're going to talk about today. So, The Neighborhood, I think realistically down in the D. It's going down in the D. For as understated and relaxing as their music might feel, the XX are a very important band that turn on the flames at just the right time. We're talking about Jamie XX, Romy Croft, and Oliver Sim. Them together as the XX is a certain kind of magic, and while they broke out with their debut album in '09, it really didn't make it stateside until the early 2010s, and they became super important with albums like Coexist, which I don't think were quite as great, but also I See You. That was a big bounce back in 2017. I think for the XX, I comfortably put them in the A. Continuing with the theme of British bands that broke out in the late 2000s but really got their start in the 2010s, Florence and the Machine come flying in next. We had Dog Days Are Over finally taking them worldwide. I believe it was with a MTV performance in '09 or 2010, and with their next album, Ceremonials, everything changed. It's an incredible effort, and I think Florence Welch as a songwriter continued to be a poignant voice in music throughout the decade. They become one of my favorite bands, and I'm putting them in the S tier, both for personal liking and for overall importance to music. Highly Suspect are up next, and I have such a complicated time ranking them because they're this band that had a great start to their decade, to their career with Mr. Asylum, The Boy Who Died Wolf, but they ended the decade on an absolute stinker that has me thinking that they're never going to bounce back from this fully. MCID was just a nightmare, so I'm going in between, split the difference. Let's put Highly Suspect in C. 21 Pilots, where do we even begin with a duo as powerful as this? I know that they're not for everyone, and they can come across a bit too quirky, maybe on like their 2013 album Vessel that really put them on the map. I think by the time we got to Blurry Face, they were just this worldwide phenomenon, and they didn't have to follow it up with something so great, but Trench did exactly that. And Scaled and Icy wasn't in the 2010s, so just basing it on their output and their work during that decade, S tier all the way. Nothing More is an interesting story because this band were around for a while before they got any sort of attention, at least in a mainstream setting, but with their self-titled album Nothing More in 2014, I hopped on board, a lot of others did too, and the Stories We Tell Ourselves, the follow-up album, not quite as great. They take their time in between projects, clearly, because we only got 2 to go off of. I think it was solid enough. I like what this band do. I'm putting them in the B. 5 Seconds of Summer, everyone's favorite, not a boy band, but people still call them a boy band for some reason. I respected that they at least co-wrote their material, they played instruments on it and stuff like that. It was a lot of fun, and while their stuff was super cheesy, especially in the early years, and I didn't really think that they had a full album just chock full of hits, I can't say that they were one of the most important bands out there, but I do think that they get their unfair amount of hate, and by the time that they got to an album like Calm, I mean, they were just doing their own thing. I respect that, so I'll put them in the C. It's closer to B almost, but definitely not a D. We just did 5 Sauce, so why not throw a fair shake over to 1D? 5 Sauce open for them after all. One Direction were probably the biggest boy band of the decade. They were from the UK, they got assembled over on the X Factor UK, and I think they were actually pretty solid. I mean, obviously, there was a big appeal to teenagers type of thing, and I got into it probably at the cutoff point. I mean, I think I was a senior in high school when they actually got together, so by the time they started releasing albums, it was a little painful to sit through in the early days. But with an album like 4, they really turned it around. I think they had some great songs in the mix. Some of the singles are still memorable to this day. So One Direction? I don't know, man. I think I'm gonna put them a notch higher at B. Up next, we have the HAIM sisters, who garnered a ton of indie acclaim with their breakout debut album, Days Are Gone. I love that album, I really do. But Something to Tell You, the one that followed it, didn't necessarily feel like it was worth a 4-year wait between records for a sophomore album, only to come across as a bit of a slump. I think they got a little bit more on track after that. But HAIM, I get complicated feelings because the talent is absolutely there. The voices, the instrumentation, the retro throwback appeal. I'm still gonna give them a B tier pass. Young the Giant are an incredible band. I think that they're well known, but at the same time still very underrated. I think that Samir Gadia as a vocalist is just incredible. He's able to bring so much persuasion and emotion to the music, and they have an eclectic range of instruments behind them. I really appreciate their contributions to music, to the alt-rock scene. They had one of my favorite albums of the decade in Home of the Strange, and I'm gonna put them up there at the A tier. And falling back down to earth next, we have everyone's favorite soundtrack kings, Imagine Dragons. I think commercial core really became a thing with the indie pop, alt-rock, alt-pop movement of the early 2010s that saw bands like Imagine Dragons just blowing up to the stratosphere. They're still extremely popular, and they held on, and for that, I have to give them some sort of credit, but at the same time, you could do a lot better than listening to them. I think they're a good gateway band, but at the same time, I just don't see a ton to their shtick, so I'm gonna give them a light D tier. The hard-rocking duo Royal Blood are blasting down the doors next. This was just a phenomenal act that really caught my attention with their debut self-titled album in 2014. I knew there was something special from the moment that I heard Out of the Black, and I really think they connected with the masses for good reason. Their follow-up album, How Did We Get So Dark, definitely still a lot of firepower behind that one. They just really did this throwback hard rock sound with their own twist very well. They were great live, too, the couple of times that I saw them, and Royal Blood, honestly, let's go A tier. The 1975 had an interesting decade, and by interesting, I mean like they had a pinball decade where they were all over the map, but they got started with their EPs in the early 2010s, and their self-titled album came out in 2013. I Like It When You Sleep was actually one of my favorite albums of the decade, but they started really changing things up with A Brief Inquiry into Online Relationships. I just had mixed feelings on a lot of the stuff that they were doing by that point, but they were still a very important band to this time, so I'm gonna put them in the B tier. God's favorite boy band, up next we have WATERPARKS, fronted by Austin Knight. They're definitely eccentric, sugar rush type music, and it can be a little off-putting, I get that, especially at first if you're listening to them and you're like, wow, this is just way too rambunctious and maybe overly ambitious, but their songs are so ridiculously catchy. They don't always stick the landing. They've done some very weird stuff, but just based on the stuff that they put out during the 2010s, I think WATERPARKS are deserving of at least a C tier. I mean, maybe B, but I think C is a little bit more fair. All hail the power of Papa, Cardinal Copia, and the Nameless Ghouls. It's Ghost up next, the hard rock and heavy metal with traces of pop also band that definitely threw it back to the 60s, the 70s, the 80s with their own flavor. Ghost are awesome, and while they've done some songs that I don't think are as great, their albums typically stand out pretty well, especially the stuff that they were putting out during the 2010s. They really hit a peak at a pinnacle with their album Meliora in 2015. I'm putting Ghost A tier. Sauntering their way in next, we have the Struts from the UK. This band are definitely the definition of glam rock, throwback rock and roll, but the difference between them and a lot of other acts that I just don't care for as much, like Dirty Honey, is the fact that they just actually have the charisma to sell it. Tracks like Body Talks, even with Kesha, Could Have Been Me. I think that they are one of those bands that definitely get it right when it comes to the retro worship. I'll give them a B tier. Five Finger Dick Punch are up next, and I wonder where they're gonna land. This band are the epitome of everything that shouldn't be about mainstream radio hard rock, trying to be edgelord, trying to ram everything down our throats like you're the most brutal person to ever exist on the planet, but you're not that. That's not it at all. Instead, you're just a little bit of an F tier, and it makes sense with as many Fs are in your name. Back in the fold, let's cleanse our palates. Nothing But Thieves are up next. They're an alternative rock band from the UK, and they are heavy hitters. By the time that they got to their sophomore album, Broken Machine, I knew that this band was unstoppable. Connor Mason, an incredibly good vocalist, and I just love the power even their debut album had. It caught me off guard. Their EPs that they put out, the albums, blow after blow, S tier. We're just going polar opposites here, apparently, because we're going SF, 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 and another F tier band is presenting itself next because it's AJR, and I really don't want to talk about them very much at all, other than the fact that they are basically Disney adult hyper music that tries to be quirky and edgy for the sake of it, but falls flat on its face every time because they stuff every track full to the brim of nightmare fuel. That's AJR, and if that sounds interesting, then go for it. All is right in the world again because Vampire Weekend are here to set us back on the righteous path. This band might have stumbled a little bit with the loss of a huge member in Rostam, and I do think that was felt on their effort Father of the Bride, but we can't sit here and argue with albums like Contra and how influential both they and modern vampires of the city truly are. I think those records definitely really pushed the indie movement of the time beyond what most people were thinking of, and I really have to give a hats off S tier. In the strange case of bands that I should like a lot more than I do, and I think they should be a lot better than they are, Hailstorm have some wasted potential on their hands, and I really wish that Lizzie Hale had done more with her bandmates to actually make albums that stand out like The Strange Case Of, but albums like Wildlife, they just were coasting by, and I really don't feel like they ever lived up to the full potential. I like their hard rocking sound and the metallic edges, but still, C. I belong with you, you belong with me, you're my C heart. The Lumineers, man, I never really got the full hype of the band. I do rank them a little bit higher because I appreciate that they got a little bit more notoriety, they got people thinking outside of the box when it came to indie and folk-leaning stuff. I personally just didn't care for this band a ton. They kept shedding members throughout the decade, which affected and impacted their sound, so I think a C is fair. Now here's a band that know how to piss people off. They just get under the skin, they crawl up there, and everybody hates them. And what was their crime against humanity? Sounding a little bit too much like Led Zeppelin. And I have to beg the question, isn't it better to have another Led Zeppelin than it is to have another clone of a clone of a clone of an already shitty band? I mean, why not bring back this vintage sound? I think their guitarist Jake is pretty incredible. He's able to shoot some flames. The band are tight. The brothers are tight as well as their cousin. And I'm gonna have to put them in a B. The story so far, complicated feelings. I had so many people that were telling me like, oh, you've got to check out this like pop punk band. They've got heavier sounds. They've got stuff that you would like. And I just didn't connect for the longest time, and I understand that that's a very unpopular opinion, but my thoughts started to change by the time Proper Dose rolled around, and I found myself actually seeing other sides of the band. My fiance is a huge fan of them. That definitely helped influence me checking out more of their stuff, but I really do think that they're very solid. They're great live, they have a ton of energy, they've shown that they're dynamic with Proper Dose, and I can't wait to see whatever it is that they do next. I'll put them in the B. Cage the Elephant are always fun to talk about. I love them, I really do. I think that they've got a lot of great rock sounds, and they've been a staple in the alternative space for a long time now. The 2010s were their decade. It seemed like they couldn't stop getting alternative #1 hits, and I think most of them are absolutely deserving of that. I think I can easily, comfortably put them in the A tier. I really thought Glass Animals were going to be a novelty act after hearing Gooey, but they proved me wrong. They put out stuff that really resonated with people, and I had no idea how popular they were until they actually started getting attention in the mainstream, which made me rethink them and reevaluate in some ways. I appreciate them for trying to bring something new to the table, but a lot of it just came off a little bit too fantastical and trying to be weird for my personal taste. I think Glass Animals, I'm a little conflicted, but I'll put C. C for conflicted. Black Veil Brides, I feel like I'm putting them on here out of obligation to keep things fair and balanced, but it was a suggestion, and fair enough. They were super popular with a certain, I guess, demographic and scene. I never really thought that they were all that great. I mean, there's a few songs, like In the End, that are like, yeah, horns up, I'm rocking out. But overall, I just think they were a little bit more style over substance, and they kind of circled the drain when it came to creativity, so I think I'm being fair by putting them in the D. MGMT saw a swell of indie hype like I've probably never seen before, coming out of the 2000s and getting to Congratulations, their underrated masterpiece in 2010. This bander's something else, man. They're a duo, they do a lot with their sound, and the album Little Dark Age, Congratulations, I think the self-titled to an extent. I mean, it was a little weirder and out there, but there's still some killer songs. They're just incredibly talented, and there's no way I can't not give them at least A. Taking it a notch further, I think anyone who knows me, knows my channel, knows my taste in music, know exactly where Wolf Alice are gonna go. They're again from the UK. They just do it better across the pond, man. And this band, both live in the studio, they don't miss, they don't have bad songs, they just continuously reinvent, progress, and keep doing what they do best simultaneously. S tier. Fuck Neck Deep, mate, they're shit. But at the same time, they were also really good in terms of being on top of their pop-punk game. They were probably the biggest band at one point in time, after like Life's Not Out to Get You and The Piece of the Panic that had huge singles off of it like In Bloom. I really do like them. They definitely lost a lot of their edge and they struggled with all of the lineup changes, but I think they're still worthy of a B. To follow that up in a similar scene of pop-punk and pop-punk adjacent, we have the Wonder Years, who were not as popular as Neck Deep, but they were better than Neck Deep. Just the fact that they thought outside of what the typical pop-punk band would do. There was so much catharsis and pain in their music, and the conceptual elements are fantastic for the likes of The Greatest Generation. I can't not put S tier for the Wonder Years. Excess hype can be a buzzkill, and Alt-J experienced this firsthand. I knew so many people, and even people that I'd met through the internet, they were just so sick of hearing about Alt-J because every publication was writing them up like they were God's gift to humanity, and they were just this weird melting pot of your next addictions, and instead they just kind of fell off a bit throughout the decade. I don't know how much outside of An Awesome Wave and parts of This Is All Yours were really all that great. I don't come back to them a ton, but I do recognize their importance to the indie movement of the times. I'll give them a strong C tier. Plastering a blend of hardcore punk, metal, industrial, a little bit of everything, we have Code Orange just rising to the surface as this band that really were out to change the world. And while maybe they've lost their mission statement at least a little bit in recent times, I think that Code Orange are still a pretty incredible force to be reckoned with, and I'll put them in the A tier. Catfish and the Bottlemen have so much potential, but they just keep harping on the same notes over and over again, and I acknowledge that they're very popular, and I think that those who like the bread and butter rock thing that they do are going to like that, but for as popular as they are and for as recognizable as the name is, I really don't think they're all that special outside of a handful of singles, and I mean, their first album, The Balcony, is pretty solid as well. I think I'll put them in the D tier. Walk the Moon, man, I can't believe their debut self-titled album is a decade old, but here we are, getting older and older, that plus Talking Is Hard, and also their 2017 effort that was a little bit more, I guess, uneven in terms of quality. They're still a great band. I love the energy, the infectious 80s synth-pop melodies meets alternative rock with a modern twist. They do their sound well, they're a lot of fun, they're just a very colorful, vibrant band, so I think I'll put Walk the Moon in the A tier. Only 3 left to go, and we've just stumbled into the lion's den. It's Ron Ronnie Radke, aka Falling in Reverse. He's really the only mainstay that's always the face of the band, and of course, how could it not be with his ego being the size of Antarctica? This is one of those bands that I like some of their songs. I really do have to acknowledge how well Ronnie is able to kind of capitalize on the fact that he has this edgy persona and that he has a solid voice and that he can scream and sing and rap. And while not everything is held up all that well, I still can feel okay and sleep well at night putting them in the sea. Phantogram are underrated. It was a suggestion that I got from a viewer to include them on this list, and while not everyone knows them, I think that you should definitely check them out if you haven't. Eyelid Movies, Voices, even 3, they've put out some incredible albums that really transport the mind. They do this thing with electronic music where it's rooted in some traditional instrumentation, but they're able to spice it up with just the way that they work as a duo in the studio. They're a ton of fun live. I'm gonna put Phantogram in the A tier. And finally, we close it out with a band that I don't necessarily know everything from because they put out so many damn albums that I actually haven't heard almost all of them. But what I do know of them, they're incredibly important, they're always versatile, they're always changing, stepping it up, and each time I check out a song from them, or even an album, I just feel like I've been exposed and overwhelmed at the same time. And while personally, I cannot seem to keep up, and I don't think I could ever keep up with everything that they do as a unit, they're super important. I really do think this is a great band. King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard in the S tier. That's a wrap on this tier list power ranking for 2010's bands. If you enjoyed this and made it all the way to the end, you're an MVP. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit that like button to support longer content like this. Subscribe if you're new in town, and check out my 2000s power ranking on screen, along with another recent upload. All of my socials can be found in the description, and I'll see you soon for more on Beyond ARTV.